All right, let me get this going here. So, hello everybody. Thanks for everyone for joining. Looks like we got a good number of people in already. If you don't know why you're here, I'm sure you do, but we're going to be talking about how to choose the best hardware for DaVinci Resolve. We'll talk a little bit about the studio version, the free version if you're still using that, and how hardware impacts everything, how Resolve behaves, and everything along that line. Now, before we really get started, I did want to launch a poll here. If you guys wouldn't mind filling it in, this is just to help me, primarily to help me make sure I am tailoring the content of this for where you are. Whether it comes to familiarity with hardware, with Resolve, which like tabs in Resolve you tend to have the most problems with. So toss that in if you could. This helps me again tailor this for you guys. While that's going, I'll also mention that there is a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat if you want to use that, but Q&A is where appreciate if you have any questions as we go through. I'll probably leave most of the questions for the very end just because I always put way too much stuff into my webinars, so I'm going to try to keep things moving along, but usually we do get to every question at the end. So if you have a question at any point, just toss it in the Q&A and we'll get it at the end. So what I'm going to be talking in this webinar, so I always have like a brief introduction section, a few minutes talking about myself, Puget, note on some benchmarks and how we do those. DaVinci Resolve versus free. I want to talk about the main aspects of the two versions, especially when it comes to performance. The parts of DaVinci Resolve and how they behave, especially when it comes to hardware. And then getting into the hardware side of things, the processor, memory, video card, storage, those kind of things. So this is what I'm kind of the outline, the agenda, excuse me, of what we're going to be covering here today. So if you are not familiar with Puget Systems, you just saw us through social media or whatever, we are a hardware manufacturer. We specialize in a lot of different areas, but content creation is our biggest. So DaVinci Resolve, obviously, but video editing, photography and photo editing, VFX. We also do stuff for like game dev or virtual production. Now is where's that kind of stuff is kind of going, rendering, all that kind of stuff. And at Puget, I'm part of our labs team. I've been part of our labs department for, I don't know, a dozen years or something like that. And our role basically in labs is to look at the hardware that's out there from Intel, NVIDIA, AMD, and all those guys. Look at the software from Blackmagic, Adobe, all of them, and the workflows that people are actually doing in the real world, and kind of marrying all three of those together. So what is the right hardware for each application and based on different workflows. So getting all the way down to the workflow level. And most of the testing we do ends up in our public hardware articles. So if you go to our website, you go to publications and articles. You can also filter, that's what that left arrow there is for, by software or by hardware type. Again, most of the testing we do ends up there on the web. So if you want to dive deep into it, you absolutely can. But we also do these kind of webinars to help distill it down into a single session of this is what we've learned, so that you don't have to be quite as deep in the hardware, because sometimes those things kind of get into the weeds. All that information also goes onto our recommended systems. So that's kind of how we decide what hardware ends up on our systems for, in this case, DaVinci Resolve, because there's a lot of ways you can make wrong decisions when it comes to hardware. And so we take out all of the stuff that's not the right choice for DaVinci Resolve, and we only list the hardware that makes sense. So you don't end up spending a whole bunch of money on something that's going to get you lower performance, because that is actually very easy to do. Okay, at this point, I'm going to stop the poll real quick and just kind of look over the results. So it looks like actually the majority of people here are fairly early in Resolve. So either starting out or, mostly comfortable, mostly the color tab. Good. Pretty good knowledge on hardware, so that's good to know. I don't have to kind of, tailor it too far down. And that's great. Okay. So let's get into this a little bit more. I also did want to mention before we get into the main meat that we do have a benchmark for DaVinci Resolve. So this was developed by ourselves. It's free for personal use. So if you're just using it for yourself, you're not like putting up hardware articles or YouTube videos about it. It's fine for you to use for free. You can just get it from pugetsystems.com/go/dr benchmark. And the really nice thing I think with that benchmark is, any benchmark is kind of a kind of a one size fits all. I mean, we test different codecs, H.264, ProRes, Red, OpenFX, and all that kind of stuff. But the main thing I think is really useful for is to give you an idea of like ROI. It's like, okay, if you're going to do a hardware upgrade, going to buy a new system, what's the return on your investment? Because if you run the benchmark on your own system and you look at like our hardware articles or what I'm going to be sharing here today, and you see like, oh, it's a new system would only be 5% faster. That's probably not worth the investment. But if you do the benchmark and you see that, oh, a new system would be 2 times faster, well, you can justify quite a bit if the performance is going to be 2 times faster. I mean, that's a lot of save time. And at the end of the day, the cost of a system, even like a $10,000 high-end Resolve workstation, that's not very much compared to the cost of people. Like people are very expensive, and if you can make your editors, your colorists, your VFX guys, your motion graphics, if you can make them more effective, oh man, it's going to save you way more money than the cost of a workstation. Okay, gonna get into the studio versus free, and I do see some stuff in chat. That is great, but if you have a specific question, again, just put it in the Q&A and I'll get to it at the end. So DaVinci Resolve Studio versus free. I always like to talk about this when it comes to DaVinci Resolve because I don't think some people realize how big of an impact the Studio version is. I think a lot of people get drawn into the free version of Studio or free version of Resolve because it's free, but they don't realize how much of an impact it can be even just on straight up performance. Even if the free edition has all of the features you need, you're probably going to get a nice performance boost by investing in Studio more than spending the $300 on hardware. You probably get more out of $300 to Studio. So the first big thing that's different with Studio is you get multi-GPU support. So the free edition supports a single GPU. Studio technically supports up to 8. We'll talk about this more later when we get to the GPU section, but typically you get diminishing returns the more GPUs you use. And usually around 3, sometimes 4 is where like the cutoff is. So not very many people are actually going to try to use 8 GPUs, but technically it allows for it. More and better H.264 and HEVC support. So this is a couple of screenshots. I just made all of the flavors of H.264 and HEVC I can think of. So 8, 10, and 12-bit, and then 420, 422, and 444. And the free edition basically only supported H.264 8-bit 420 correctly. It does see a few of the HEVC versions, but it was always just giving me media offline, so it doesn't work very well. Whereas the Studio version supports basically every flavor of those you can think of. Hardware decoding and encoding support is also mostly a feature of Studio. I think there might be a few things in the free edition, especially on Mac, that I think has support, but it's mostly Studio is going to get you this. And one of the big things with H.264 and HEVC trying to get hardware decoding is it really depends on the specs of your codec and your hardware. Because I mean, man, having hardware decoding support is massive. Like raw FPS is going to be higher. It's also night and day often when you're doing like scrubbing and just jumping around. Reverse playback especially is really hard with these highly compressed codecs. And so having hardware decoding support is huge. And we do have this table somewhere else. This is also going to be recorded, so you can always look at this later. But some of the big things is H.264 420, you are pretty much only going to have that even on a hardware level. So that's not a DaVinci Resolve limitation, that's a hardware limitation, and I highly doubt that we're ever going to see hardware implementations of any other flavors of H.264. It's just considered a legacy codec by a lot of people on the software and hardware side, so they're not going to invest in adding that. HEVC is where you get a little bit more hairy. 420 8-bit is supported by pretty much everything, and 10-bit 420. But if you wanted something like 10-bit 422, which I know a lot of cameras are starting to add, as like a native or a default codec, you'd really need a 11th or 12th gen Intel CPU with QuickSync in order to be able to do hardware decoding. It doesn't matter what GPU you have, whether it's a Quadro, a GeForce, a Radeon Pro, none of them have hardware level support. So you're not going to get it by anything other than the Intel CPUs with QuickSync and only the 11th gen and above. Other things, the free edition is limited to 4K 60 FPS, which honestly for most people is probably just fine. Studio technically can go up to 32K at 120 FPS. So you guys have probably seen, images like this showing like, oh yeah, HD up to 4K up to 8K, whatever. Oh, it's more like this with 32K. And honestly, I don't even know what kind of hardware you would need to do 32K. That's pretty ridiculous. I've never heard of anyone even doing 16K more than very rarely. But studio, at least you don't have to worry about it. So if you're doing some crazy like video wall thing that's super wide or something, a studio should be able to handle it. There's also just a bunch of features in Studio that aren't present in the free version. Noise reduction, which I mean, Resolve is kind of known for in the industry, is locked behind Studio. There's things like lens distortion, HDR scopes, remote grading, a lot of their new neural engine stuff. So super scaling, speed warp, object tracking, the 3D depth map, the new thing. I think that's new in 18. Looks really cool. I haven't played around with it yet, but that's only in Studio. And a whole bunch of their open effects, lens flares, dirt removal, lens reflections, all that kind of stuff are only in Studio. Okay, so I want to talk about the amalgam that is DaVinci Resolve because it is kind of different than a lot of other applications. If you have something like Premiere Pro, it's Premiere Pro. Like it has some integration with After Effects, but it's really like using the After Effects engine for that. It's not like trying to process it internally. DaVinci Resolve, though, is kind of a combination of a whole bunch of different programs. I mean, because DaVinci Resolve started off as color, and recently, what they bought Fusion, they bought Fairlight, and they've been kind of cramming it all together into one application. And there is some stuff in there that is kind of left over from when those things were standalone applications. I mean, some of them still are. Fusion still has a standalone, but they behave differently. So how DaVinci Resolve uses hardware in the color tab is different than how it uses hardware in the Fusion tab. And there's a few weird things that are worth knowing especially if you're going for a very high-end system. If you're going for a kind of a mid-range system, it's probably not going to affect you too much, but especially when you get up into higher budget levels and you're spending 10, 12, 15K, you might run into some weird things that you'll want to be aware of. So there's pretty much three aspects of DaVinci Resolve, at least the way I think about it, three different ways that hardware is used in these kind of roles. So the first is media playback codec processing. So this is going to be in the cut page, the edit page, even the color page, primarily, just wherever you're processing codecs. So it's going to highly depend on the codec and the specs, resolution, FPS, and everything. Obviously, something like H.264 is going to be different than ProRes. It's going to be different than Red. But things like hardware decoding and support comes in here. The difficulty of the codec, how well that codec handles CPU multi-threading, whether there's GPU decoding and debayering. That's mostly going to be with raw codecs. Red, BRAW. Those are going to be able to use your GPU, whereas something like ARIA raw doesn't. So that's one aspect of DaVinci Resolve. There's also all of the open effects and noise reduction. This is where the GPU comes really heavily into play. A lot of times when people are talking about performance in Resolve, this is where that kind of the discussions go, because again, this is kind of where DaVinci Resolve is known in the industry, being able to use a lot of GPU power, being able to use multiple GPUs as long as you have the studio version. But the CPU does still matter in these things. Almost anything that is on the GPU is still using the CPU somewhat, even if it is just to feed data to the GPU. So the CPU still matters. And then the third area is Fusion. So Fusion is kind of the opposite of the open effects. It's primarily going to be CPU limited. There are things in there that use the GPU, but typically the CPU is going to be your bottleneck unless you have a super crazy low-end GPU. So it's primarily CPU limited. It also doesn't scale very well with more CPU cores. Sometimes when you're processing, ProRes or whatever, you can use more CPU cores. Fusion is going to be very lightly threaded. So it's a very different CPU you want for Fusion than like color or open effects. And it also has some weird things when you get to 3 or more GPUs. It actually can give lower performance if you have more GPUs. So it's kind of a funky thing. If you're very heavy in Fusion and in like noise reduction, you kind of have to play a game of like, okay, well, how many GPUs do you want? Where do you care more? Because you can get some weird performance drops in the Fusion tab, again, if you have 3 or more GPUs. And all that comes down to being, even within DaVinci Resolve, there's not a one-size-fits-all. You could have something like a Threadripper Pro with triple GPU, and sometimes it'll be faster for editing. Things like ProRes, Red, it'll definitely be faster for editing, either because of the beefier CPU or the more GPU power. It definitely will be faster for like open effects and noise reduction because of the triple GPU. but it'll be slower for Fusion because having all of those cores doesn't really help you in Fusion. And typically, the more cores you have, the lower the individual performance per core, which is what Fusion wants. So it'll be a bit slower for Fusion. On the other hand, something like a Intel Core i9s, like a consumer CPU with just a single GPU, much cheaper system than like Threadripper Pro with triple GPU. Sometimes it will be faster for editing. Not for ProRes, not for Red, but it can definitely be if it's like H.264 or HEVC, where you can have hardware decoding. Because even in the cases where you can either use the GPU or QuickSync for hardware decoding, typically QuickSync is a little bit better. So it can be actually faster if you're using one of those codecs. It definitely will be slower for like OpenFX and noise reduction because you don't have as much GPU power, but it will be faster for Fusion. So, and that's whether you're in the Fusion tab or you're using, Fusion clips in the edit tab, lower thirds and, overlays and those kind of things. So that's kind of the things you got to think about with DaVinci Resolve. And I'll be talking about all three of those kind of categories as we talk about hardware. So I'll kind of break it down whenever there is something different. So if Fusion comes more into play with some piece of hardware, I'll talk about that specifically as we get into this. Okay, so really getting into the hardware. Oh man, I see a lot of questions. Again, I'll get those at the end just because I'm worried about going over time here. But so hardware, what hardware is best for DaVinci Resolve? Let's get into the meat of all of this. It's mostly going to come down to these four categories: CPU, GPU, RAM, and storage. And I'm actually going to go CPU, RAM, GPU, storage just to kind of lay it out because CPU and GPU is kind of a bigger topic. It's going to be a much beefier section versus RAM and storage is a little bit more straightforward. But typically, these are the four categories that are going to impact performance, going to impact how efficient you're going to be in DaVinci Resolve, how quickly you're going to be able to work, how much less frustrating it can be, because it always sucks to wait on your software or wait on your computer. So we're going to start off with the CPU. CPU often dictates a lot of other things. Whichever CPU you're going to use, oftentimes is going to dictate what. It's always going to dictate what type of motherboard you're going to use, which can come into play with like, how many GPUs can you have, how much RAM can you have. So CPU is a critical component in DaVinci Resolve. Also just again straight up for performance, it's always going to come into play. And there's basically three different groups of processors, at least the way I tend to think about it. You have the consumer grade CPUs, the Intel Core series, the AMD Ryzen. You have the HEDT or high-end desktop, the Intel X series and AMD Threadripper. And then you've got the workstation class CPUs, the Intel Xeon W, AMD Threadripper Pro. Technically, there's also the server stuff, the Dual Xeon, the Epics. Those typically you don't even want to think about for DaVinci Resolve. They just make absolutely no sense. But just kind of go through these three categories. So the consumer CPUs, though, have anywhere from 6 to 16 cores. The core line, the latest generation, has hybrid architectures that have performance and efficient cores. So it's a little bit wonky how you think about core counts. But let's just give you a range. They support 128 gigs of RAM. Typically, you don't want to use more than 2 GPUs. On some motherboards, you technically can, but you're going to be lowering the performance. So typically, you only use 2 GPUs at most with these consumer-grade platforms. Cost is pretty darn good. And then I'm also going to put performance in here for our overall score in DaVinci Resolve, so just kind of a general performance in DaVinci Resolve, and performance in here for Fusion. And I'm going to base the other ones on kind of these consumer scores. But they're pretty darn good, honestly. They're really good performance these days. Then there's the HEDT line. They have up to 64 cores. They can handle twice the memory, so 256 gigs of memory. They have more PCIe lanes, so typically you can use 2 or 3 GPUs. Cost is, of course, a little bit higher. The performance in DaVinci Resolve, interestingly enough, is a little bit lower overall than the consumer CPUs. Our overall score is about 10% lower. Fusion, it's more like 35% lower, again, because the single core performance on the consumer CPUs are terrific, whereas HEDT, not as much. They're more about core count. And I will also give a little caveat here that negative 10% on the overall score, just remember that is a overall score. So things like ProRes and Red, they're probably actually a little bit faster. But those consumer CPUs, especially the core line, because of QuickSync, they can handle like H.264 and HEVC a little bit better. So it kind of nudges them a little bit above. Oh, but also the X series, the Intel X series is pretty much no longer. Uh, it's available. It's technically current gen, but it's very vastly outdated. They haven't released a new product for years. We've stopped selling X series a long time ago. No one should ever really be buying an X series anymore. But also, the Threadripper line is kind of up in the air right now. So AMD is launching the new Threadripper Pros. Well, they've been kind of launching them for months. And we haven't heard all that much about the Threadripper line itself. Sometimes AMD has said like, "Oh yeah, of course Threadripper will be here," but then there's no talk about it. So we don't really know what's really going to be going on with Threadripper. So just kind of be aware with that. And then the workstation line. So core count can be up to 64 cores. They don't typically go beyond that. They can support a whole lot more RAM. Some of them can go up to 4 TB. It depends a lot on the CPU and your motherboard, though, as well. Typically, on these, we go up to 512, sometimes a terabyte. They have a lot more PCIe lanes, especially Threadripper Pro, so you can use up to 4 GPUs technically. Um, the modern GPUs, the high-end GPUs that you'd probably be wanting to use if you're using multi-GPUs, they have such high power draw though that you can't effectively use more than 3. If you want to get up to 4, you either have to do really weird stuff with like power supplies, do like dual power supply, which then you're running into the problem of you're drawing too much power than a standard circuit, a 15 or 20 amp circuit. So you have to like be plugged in. You have to decide like, do you want your oven or do you want your computer to be able to be plugged in, because you have to use that plug. So typically we don't use quad GPU anymore. We're limited to triple. Cost is obviously going to be higher. There's to be able to have all that more RAM, have all that more PCIe lanes. They've got 8-channel memory as well, so the faster memory performance. Yeah, you got to pay for that. Performance wise, you do get a performance bump over the consumer CPU. So overall, it averages up about to 11%. But again, some of that is because of the H264 and HEVC stuff. So for things like ProRes, Red, BRAW, ARIRAW, it's going to be a lot more than that. It's going to be more like 30, sometimes maybe even 40% higher. So keep that in mind. Again, though, Fusion, not quite as good. So if you really care about Fusion, you want to be doing the motion graphics or VFX stuff, consumer grade CPUs are actually the best you can get. It's unfortunate they only do 128 gigs of RAM, but just like the time to process each frame, consumer CPUs are actually the best. Workstation stuff, especially because of the RAM, though, sometimes that's better just to have more RAM, because then that's more frames that are cached. So it kind of offsets the performance. So that's kind of the 3 categories of CPUs that you might want to be looking at. Now, I'm actually going to brush over the HEDT and pretty much not talk about them again, because X series is obsolete. Threadripper, we don't really know what's going on, and it's actually not that much different in performance than the Threadripper Pros. It's just a little bit lower, so you can kind of infer where things are there. To give you an idea of what we do internally as far as workstations for DaVinci Resolve. So obviously, I mean, we cater a little bit more towards the higher end market, but just to give you an idea of how our sales break down, about half of our sales for DaVinci Resolve are actually on a consumer platform. They were rising a little bit, a little bit longer ago with the 12th gen CPUs. They've mostly migrated over to Intel. So this is over the last 6 months, though. And even though we cater very much to the higher end market, still half of our systems that we sell for Resolve are using consumer grade hardware. Again, mostly the Intel 12th gen. And a lot of that is because of the better quick sync performance and capability for HEVC, especially. So a lot of people still shoot HEVC. A lot of people have a lot of drone footage, a lot of GoPros, and being able to process that stuff faster is worth its weight. So a lot there. A little bit of HEDT still. I think a lot of this stuff is going to be migrating up to the workstation class, which is where the remaining 30% of our systems are being sold right now for DaVinci Resolve, Xeon Ws, Threadripper Pro. I think it's mostly Threadripper Pro right now, but we'll talk a bit about that in here in a second. So on this consumer line, we always get asked AMD or Intel. And so this is a chart from one of our testing when the 12th gen CPUs came out. So 12th gen's in green here, AMD Ryzen are in blue. And obviously you can kind of see right here that, it's going to be a little bit faster there. You're looking at about 11% performance overall, higher performance with the Intel 12th gen. It's going to be more. Again, I'm repeating myself. It's going to be more for H.264 and HEVC because of QuickSync. A little bit less for things like ProRes. Um, but yeah, even at the lower end as well. So if you're on a super tight budget, it's still about the same. It's a little bit more than 10%. I also did want to call out Fusion here because Fusion is quite a bit faster. This is another area in addition to like HEVC where Intel has a strong lead, and that's going to be about 20%. So if you do a lot of lower thirds, that kind of stuff, or obviously, higher in VFX work, there you go. And so a few things to note with this. This is on Windows 11. We're using DDR5 memory with the 12th gen. So that gives it a little bit of a boost. It does raise the price a little bit. But yeah. Um, and I think that's mostly it. It's mostly just I wanted to note the DDR5 thing. Okay. So what that really means is that for the consumer grade CPUs right now, Intel just has a very, very strong lead. You can absolutely use Ryzen. Ryzen's a great platform, but for DaVinci Resolve, especially if you are using HEVC or H.264, it just gives you a nice boost, and it's just probably the better choice for most people, considering just DaVinci Resolve. I mean, if you're also talking a bunch of other applications or you want to do gaming or whatever, obviously your choices are going to change. But for just DaVinci Resolve, really the Intel Core 12th Gen is terrific right now. For the workstation level, so going all the way up, you again, this here's performance here. It's less of a spread in performance. Between Intel and AMD at the top end, you're only looking about a 5% difference. So honestly, if you're going to be spending, max budget kind of a thing, you're not looking at a giant difference in performance overall, at least. One of the things that's interesting though is that for higher end codecs and workflows, so talking about like 8K, so 8K Red or 8K HEVC, the AMD platform does take a little bit larger of a lead, somewhere around 20% at most. So for those higher end workflows, AMD does take a bit of a lead with the with like 8K media and that kind of stuff. I did want to point out a few little things here. One is that AMD, you do get a performance gain all the way up to 64 cores. Intel is kind of weird. They have this 38 core model. I'm not sure if you can even see my mouse, but they have like a 38 core model right there in the middle, and it's about the same performance as the 32 core. So you don't really get a performance gain as you go up. And actually, that 38 core is a really weird CPU. I don't want to get into the details of why, but Windows is kind of weird when you get above 32 cores, and 38 is just an odd number. And in some applications, Premiere Pro, Photoshop, a few others, performance just tanks on that CPU, and it's just awful. So typically, even if you are going to go with the Intel Xeon, we recommend sticking to the 32 core or below. The 38 core is just a wonky product. I think I had those things backwards. I think that thing was supposed to fade in. But so what it comes down to is for workstation class things, I would say right now, Ryzen Threadripper is a slight lead, a slight advantage. Xeon W is not bad, but Threadripper Pro is probably the lead. That's what we tend to recommend for higher end workflows for DaVinci Resolve right now. I will also mention that Threadripper Pro 5000, the new Threadripper Pros are kind of mid-launch. They were a Lenovo exclusive for a little while. We actually have samples and we're doing performance testing right now on them. So we should have testing and articles up probably next week looking at the Threadripper Pro 5000s. And I'll tell you right now, it's not a huge difference in DaVinci Resolve. So if you're thinking about getting a system Threadripper Pro, you probably don't need to wait. I mean, we still don't know about availability and when all that stuff is going to be. But the Threadripper Pro 3000s are pretty darn good, but you could wait for the 5000s whenever those do come out. The last thing I'll mention about CPUs is just be aware that more cores is not always more better. DaVinci Resolve scales pretty decently, but going up to something like a dual Xeon is typically a bad idea. If you look in our public database or benchmark stuff and the testing we've done in the past, typically something like a dual Xeon or dual EPYC is going to be slower than a consumer grade platform significantly. So there's really not a good reason to do dual Xeon. So I know sometimes, and we've heard from our customers that some of the big guys, the Dells, HPs, and all them, Lenovo's, they try to push people into like a dual Xeon because, wow, it's a professional application. So DaVinci Resolve, yeah, you should use a dual Xeon, and it's awful. It's terrible. Don't do it. Don't give in to their marketing pushes. They're just trying to get as much money out of you as possible. That's the way to do it. And it is a bad choice. You don't need them for the core counts, where DaVinci Resolve is going to be able to take advantage of it. You don't need them for the memory capacity anymore. You don't need them for the PCIe lanes anymore. All you're doing is paying more money for lower performance and higher complexity, or higher complexity. Bleh, can't talk. So it's just more points of failure, which is not a good idea in a workstation. Something that you want to have maximum uptime. Okay, looks like I'm doing about on time with me, but I'm going to try to fit all this into the next 15 minutes. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm probably going to go about 10 minutes over. So hopefully that's okay with you guys. But so talk about CPU, shifting over to RAM. RAM's a lot more simple in a lot of ways. So this will be a much shorter section. The main thing with RAM is capacity is more important than speed, is what it really comes down to. If you don't have enough RAM, that's going to make your system slow to a crawl. If you have high speed RAM, fast or overclocked RAM, that kind of stuff. Typically in DaVinci Resolve, even in Fusion that uses RAM a little bit more heavily, you're going to see like a percent or two performance difference. So typically going with that like high speed RAM is just going to make your system less stable, because your processor has a certain RAM speed that it is rated for. So a lot of the Threadripper Pro 3200 megahertz. Ryzen is typically 3200. Technically, you get kind of weird, but 3200 is what's safe. Same with 12th gen. And you go beyond that, you're overclocking. And overclocking RAM is probably one of the easiest ways to get an unstable system without realizing it. So a lot of the times, that's one of the reasons I think why you see people with PC and they're like, my system, DaVinci Resolve's unstable, or whatever, my system's crashing. A good chunk of the time, more than you might expect, it's because of higher speed RAM than what their system is actually supposed to use. I will put a little caveat here. DDR5 is some new stuff, and it is quite a bit faster than DDR4. I think we saw a 10 to 15% performance gain using DDR5 over DDR4 for the Intel 12th gen CPUs, which are the only ones that support DDR5 right now. So that's a pretty good performance bump. It's basically like bumping up your CPU model, up one level, or sometimes even two. So DDR5 is better, but still stay within spec for your CPU whenever possible. It's not always easy to find out what that is, but I mean, honestly, that's part of the reason why we're around and why we sell workstations, is because we do that qualification for you. But if you're building your own system, buying from someone else, just make sure it's within spec. So if capacity is the main thing, well, how much? Well, the one thing is if you're using Fusion, to any real degree, you're doing a lot of work in Fusion. It's pretty much you just always want more. It's very similar to After Effects in that way. If you use After Effects as well, where all of the frames can be cached into RAM, and so by having enough RAM, you don't have to reprocess those frames when you go back and play again, just so you can kind of see what it looks like. And the things you haven't changed don't have to be reprocessed over and over and over. So for something like Fusion, it's really just, man, get as much as you really can reasonably afford. I mean, you don't go crazy, don't get like 2 terabytes of RAM with a super low in CPU, but still balance it, but err on the side of more. For everything else, this is kind of our general go-to recommendation. Things really change, depending on what you're doing, because you also need enough RAM for the other things in your system. Are you also having, 500 Chrome tabs open? Are you also using Photoshop? Are you also doing a bunch of other stuff? So this is kind of a minimum RAM recommendation, but 4K, sometimes you can get away with 32 gigs of RAM. 6K, 64, 8K or higher is where you want 128 gigs or higher. So that's just kind of a rule of thumb. But especially with RAM, if anything, you want to err a bit on the side of having a little bit too much rather than too little, because having too little is going to suck for performance. Having too much, it's not going to increase performance by having more RAM that's not being used, but it at least won't slow your system down. So that's very important. And just like CPU, I wanted to point out kind of what we are using in our own workstations. So over the last 6 months, about half of our systems, we do 128 gigs of RAM. About, what was that, close to 20 do about 64, and then the rest are pretty evenly spread between 32, so very light lower end systems for DaVinci Resolve, or going up to the 256 or 512 gigs of RAM. So that just kind of gives you a spread. Most common is 128, but higher end stuff you might go up, lower end stuff you can go down. Oh, and again, I already mentioned this, but yeah, make sure you factor in all the other applications you're going to want to be using because, like, if Photoshop is sitting idle just in the background, it's not going to be using any more of your CPU or your GPU, but it is going to be sitting on that chunk of RAM that it really needs. So always think about all that kind of stuff. Okay, give me just a second. I need to drink some water. And I see a lot of good questions. I will get to all of those. Do not worry. Okay, video card. So this is the second big section because a lot of people like talking about video cards and GPUs when it comes to DaVinci Resolve because, compared to something like Premiere Pro, oh man, DaVinci Resolve uses the GPU a whole lot more. So performance here. So this is the extended overall. So this is just overall performance. I will note that all of these charts are really intended for studio only. A lot of this stuff is going to be studio only. So if you're using the free edition, a lot of this won't apply. All of the greens are the GeForce cards that we've tested. So this is the full range of the 3000 series. The one blue is the single AMD that we tend to toss in. And that's just because AMD is just not great for DaVinci Resolve and a lot of pro applications like it. So, Premiere Pro, Photoshop, and all that stuff. Typically, GeForce has a big performance lead. Whether it's regardless of budget or based on dollar per performance, NVIDIA just has such a huge lead that we typically only test like one AMD card just to keep, just to make sure nothing's changed, basically. But you can see here, going from the lowest end card to the highest end card, right now, as far as overall performance goes, it's about a 30% performance difference. But, a lot of our testing in our benchmark is looking at stuff like ProRes, which does not use the GPU at all for decoding or encoding, or, exporting to DNX doesn't use the GPU at all. So there is, this kind of a thing. You kind of have to think of that, okay, this is probably what you're most likely going to see. But once you get into things like OpenFX or processing red or noise reduction, the GPU is going to come a lot more into play because, man, things like noise reduction especially, it's going to hurt when you start doing that stuff. Here's a couple of examples of where you might see more performance. So this is doing 4K red. So this is just exporting, but you're going to see similar thing for playback. It's basically you're looking at more about a 70% performance gain going from a lower end card like an RTX 3060 all the way up to a 3080 and above. Now, do note here that there is a very hard wall you hit right at the 3080 point where performance after that is basically the exact same. And that's mostly because we're probably becoming CPU limited here. So we're using the GPU. The GPU is being used for the debayering. CPU is still being used for decoding. And we're just hitting the wall where the debayering, it doesn't matter how much faster we go because the decoding side is, the limitation. Now, in DaVinci Resolve, you can change it so that the GPU is being used for debayering and decoding. Typically, I recommend against it unless you're doing a lot of testing and it's going to be best for your workflow. Simply because you probably want that extra GPU performance for things like all your color nodes and noise reduction and OpenFX and all that. So typically, it's better to keep it divided between the two. But in some workflows, you can use the GPU for both. In which case, you would see a better scaling above 3080. You probably see more performance. And I will point out again, poor AMD, that's their highest end Radeon card. The Radeon Pros are about the same in terms of performance or a bit lower. And it's equivalent to like a 3060 Ti, so not terribly great. GPU effects. So this is looking at a bunch of OpenFX, noise reduction again. We test a bunch of that stuff and we throw it all together into this one score. And here it's even more of a difference. You're looking at about almost 2.5 times increase. So the more you do things like red, BROD, noise reduction, OpenFX, the more the GPU is going to come into play and give you higher and higher and higher performance. So, yeah. Multi-GPUs. I think I messed up this one too, so I'll just show both. Multi-GPU can give you more performance. Again, studio only. And it's mostly going to come into play for, again, OpenFX, noise reduction. Red, not as much. BRAW, not as much. But there's diminishing returns here. So going from one GPU to two, even in like the best case, is about a 40% performance gain. So it's not double, it's about 40%. And then going from two GPUs to three is about a 25% performance gain. And I mentioned really early on in this session that typically we don't go beyond 3 GPUs anymore because the power draw is so high that it doesn't work with a standard power supply. And even if you go to like crazy power supplies, it's using more than a 15 or 20 amp circuit that you're probably have in your home or your office. So you don't really want to do that. Um, so it's typically we don't go beyond 3 GPUs anymore. But if you did, you're looking at, I believe it was about a 10% performance gain. So it's not even a huge gain once you get beyond 3 GPUs anyway. So yeah, diminishing returns, but it still can be a good bump depending on your workflow. Because something like A6000s, yes, they are very expensive. RTX like 3090s aren't quite as expensive, but they're still very expensive. But like I said, at the very beginning when we were talking about benchmarking, the most expensive thing is you or your employees, your editors, your colorists. So if you can make them more effective and faster, it's probably going to pay off anyway, depending on your workflows, of course. If you get into multi-GPU, you might hear about things called NVLink. So NVLink is a special technology on NVIDIA cards in NVIDIA Link. Basically what it does is it allows the two cards to talk directly to each other. Oftentimes when GPUs have to talk to each other, when they're doing like processing and stuff, they have to go through the motherboard between the cards. And that's pretty fast, but it's not as fast as NVLink, which allows them to talk just directly to each other. Now, NVLink needs software support. So a lot of things, again, like Adobe apps don't really support NVLink because they don't use the GPU enough to make it worth it. DaVinci Resolve technically does support NVLink, but not very well from what we've seen. So this is some testing we did when the NVLink was officially added to Resolve. Basically, at the very bottom there is just a single GPU. The green is with NVLink between 2 GPUs, and then those upper twos are basically NVLink is not present, but we have 2 GPUs. And interestingly, performance is better without NVLink. So just having 2 GPUs by themselves is faster than turning NVLink on. So that's kind of weird. You might also notice it actually says SLI on in these charts, not NVLink on, and that's because the way you enable NVLink in Windows is by turning on SLI. And I'm not sure if that's what's causing the problem, because in the past, enabling SLI in applications like DaVinci Resolve, SLI is not made for this kind of stuff. It's made for like gaming, and it resulted in lower performance. So I almost wonder if like SLI and NVLink are kind of like fighting. So maybe in like Linux, it would be a little bit different because you can enable NVLink without enabling SLI. But at least in Windows, it doesn't seem like it is worth the trouble. Don't worry about using it for DaVinci Resolve. So a couple of kind of reiterating some points and a little bit of new here. So NVIDIA versus AMD, it's really going to be NVIDIA. In our experience, performance is better, support is better, drivers are better, just all across the board for DaVinci Resolve, and honestly, a lot of pro applications. NVIDIA is just the way to go. AMD is great for like gaming, but that's really where they're putting their focus, is really on gaming. Even the Radeon Pros, they don't seem to get a lot of support. So typically we don't really use Radeon Pros either. I've heard good things about them in engineering. That's not my category, but I've heard good things about them in that kind of workflows. But content creation, it's really just NVIDIA. And NVIDIA does have 2 lines. They have their GeForce line, and they have their Quadro line. Technically, they rebranded. That's now NVIDIA RTX. It's just very confusing because now we have NVIDIA GeForce RTX and NVIDIA RTX. So I still tend to call them Quadro. But between those 2 lines, mostly comes down to GeForce, terrific performance for your dollar. It's really about performance. Quadro, they actually aren't quite as fast. They turn a lot of things back, and that's because they're going for maximum reliability. The cooler designs often mean that they are better for multi-GPU, especially if you go up to triple. I don't think we use GeForce at all for triple anymore. So it's really Quadro is the only way to get like triple. They have a higher VRAM ceiling, so GeForce maxes at 24 gigs. Quadro goes all the way up to 48 gigs. And the main thing I want to point out here, so the multi-GPU is big, the VRAM's big. The reliability is probably one of the biggest things as well, though, more than you think. I mean, because more reliable system is always going to be better. The fewer crashes, the fewer blue screens, the fewer times you have to send system in for repair or replace a part, the better. But I will point out that the difference between GeForce and Quadro isn't massive. I believe Quadro in the last 6 months to a year, I forget which, let's just say 6 months, we had some cards fail in-house. Most of them were due to a defective port. We had a string of bad display ports. But the card itself, no blue screens, no crashes, no anything. So we've had 0 fail like in the field and 0 like beyond a port issues fail in-house. GeForce, on the other hand, we've had little bit under a 1% failure rate overall, and about a 0.4% failure rate in the field. Once the customer gets it, so that's not very high. That's a 1 in 200 chance that GeForce might have a problem. But if you're looking for maximum reliability, you can go Quadro is probably the way to go. You're going to pay for it. At the lower end, Quadro is about $1,000 more per card. At the higher end, like a 3090 versus A6000, it's probably going to be more like a $4,000 difference. So if you're talking two cards, well, that's $8,000. So it's definitely an investment, and it totally depends on how expensive is downtime, how much do you need that VRAM, how much do you need multi GPU support. So it all comes down to what you need. Performance wise, though, I did want to throw this in here. I don't think we have a chart that directly compares them, but it's going to be somewhere around like this. So like an A6000 is going to be a little bit lower than a 3090. An A5000 is going to be a little bit lower than a 3080 Ti. A4000 is actually quite a bit down. You get a big drop. There are some new models, A4500 and A5500. Basically, just slot those in right in between, and it's going to be close. So just to give you an idea there of performance, but again, you can get triple A6000. You can't do that with GeForce, so triple A6000 will be faster than dual 3090 or 3090 Ti. So as far as what we sell, I think this is just a great gut check for a lot of people. Overwhelmingly, we sell 3090s. That number I think is going to shift more and more over to the 3090 Ti. It's just the 3090 Ti is a much newer card, so we haven't had as much time to sell them. But wait a year, I think those will be opposite. It's going to be mostly 3090 Ti's, just because a lot of our customers, they want to go for that higher end. They want that performance for noise reduction and stuff. But so that's kind of how we divide it. Very few people actually get A6000s. It's a little bit surprising, but still 6% of our customers, but that's nothing compared to GeForce. And like A5000s, we sell like none for Resolve at least. And I will also point out that of that 3090 Ti, and the A6000s, about half of those are multi-GPU. Primarily 2 GPU, a handful of triple A6000s, but it's mostly dual 3090, dual 3090 Ti, dual A6000s. So yeah, it's about more than half of our systems 3090s, about half of those are dual GPU. Okay. Oh, one more section here, and we're already over. I'll try to do this one fast and get to those Q&As because I don't want to take up everyone's time too much here. But again, if you do have to drop out because we are technically over time already, we will have recordings, and we will toss an email out to everyone who is here now, who will have a direct access to the recording. So if you have to hop out, I understand, and you will at least have recording. So storage. Big thing with storage. I always like to point out, understand the difference between megabytes per second and megabits per second. It still trips me up sometimes when I'm not being careful. And it usually comes up because cameras and codecs, you're usually talking about things in megabits per second. Whereas storage, we like to talk about things in terms of megabytes per second or gigabytes per second with newer and faster stuff. And also even some things like networking. Well, that's usually in bits. And that's really bad and confusing because there is 8 bits in 1 byte. It's dumb computer stuff, but that's just how it works. So you do have to be careful sometimes that you are taking that conversion into account. Because something like H.264 100 megabit, well, that's only about 20 megabytes per second. So it really is not that much in terms of capacity and speed. How fast things do you need? Like you can do that on almost anything. And even like ProRes, like 1.2 gigabit, well, that's actually only about 144 megabytes per second. So it's not as big of a deal often, but you just want to make sure you get those conversions right. Because I see a lot of times, especially with like networking, where people mess that up just a little bit. They're confusing bytes and bits, and they end up having big problems because they think that gigabit is going to be fast enough for them, but it turns out that no, it's actually 8 times slower than they thought. Using the right drive for what you're doing is obviously very important. I'm going to divide it by like the 3 kinds of drives, and platter drives, they're pretty darn good these days. Like they're sustained, like you're doing file copy. It's up to about 250 megabytes per second. Man, now I'm confusing myself. About 250 megabytes per second. The problem with those drives is that they have a spinning disk and a physical arm that moves around to find, to get the data. So you have seek time. It takes a little bit of time to find each little bit of data. And data is not just like written in one long line. If it's like a video file, it's not just written in one long strip. It's like spread all over the drive. So it takes time to find that stuff. And so you are introducing latency. They're also a lot noisier. Like modern drives are a lot quieter than they were 5, 10 years ago, but everything else has gotten so much quieter. Like my system sitting next to me, I can't hear it. If I put a platter drive in there, man, I would hear that platter drive just because it's got this high pitched kind of whine to them, especially the faster drives, the larger drives, like these WD Golds and stuff. So in like a modern system, especially from us and from anyone who would do cooling correctly, uh, a platter drive will be by far the loudest thing in the system at idle. When the fans ramp up and you're doing stuff, yeah, maybe not as much, but at idle especially, you're going to hear it. So we're using those drives less and less and less and less inside of computers. We're still using them in like servers and stuff, but in workstations, I don't know the stats, but it's dropping like a rock. How often there's a platter drive in our workstations? A step up there from there for what most things are being, most of these platter drives are being replaced with is SATA SSD. So solid state drives. These days, I'm sure everyone knows all about them. They're quite a bit faster sustained. They're more than twice as fast, but since they're solid state, they don't have seek time. They don't have any noise. They're highly reliable these days. We typically try to stick with Samsung drives just because, man, they've been amazing for reliability. And last I checked, it was like for the last like 4 years, we've had like one drive fail. So like it's insane reliability, way better than platter drives. The only thing I will mention though, since we talk about reliability, is solid state drives do need to have power given to them periodically. I think a lot of them are like a year, every 2 years, they need power. So they're not great for like long-term backup. Like you can take a platter drive and shove it on a shelf and you'll be able to use it 5 years later and the data will still be there, hopefully. Whereas SSDs, you might start getting data corruption if they're not powered on. Not a consideration for like inside of a system, not a really consideration for like a NAS, but if you're using for long-term storage, that is something to keep in mind. But these days, we pretty much only use them for like medium bitrate media, where like people are very budget conscious. They need very large sizes, like 8 terabyte drive, because they've been largely replaced by these NVMe drives. So these NVMe's are about the size of a stick of gum. They're insanely fast. 7.3 gigs a second. Some of the newer ones coming out are double that, like 14. And pricing has come way down. Even for like a terabyte drive, you're talking about like a $100 difference or something like that. I mean, don't quote me on that. You can look at our configure pages, but it's not a big difference in terms of price. And often, like that extra speed gain doesn't actually manifest itself in the real world. Like if you're as long as your drive is fast enough, it doesn't really matter. But sometimes it's like, man, spend $50 and get the 14 times faster performance just in case. So we're using them now for pretty much everything. OS drives, cache and scratch drives, they're terrific for. If you have really high bitrate media, you're doing like 8K red or 8K raw stuff, they're terrific. So we use them all over the place now. The other thing with drives is you probably want to think about a multi-drive setup. This is one of the things that you can get out of a PC compared to like a Mac. That is a big boon, I think, in a lot of different ways, being able to keep all this stuff internally and having a multi-drive setup. So first is just like an OS drive, probably going to be an NVMe. Depends on how much apps you want to have installed, how large you let your downloads folder and your documents folders get, how often you want to have to empty your recycle bin. But typically 500 gigs or above. I like terabyte drives, but that's just me. But so a dedicated drive just for that stuff. Second is a cache and scratch drive. Again, totally depends on your workflow. Typically, our customers use at least a 500 gig drive. Terabyte drives, as they're coming down in price, are becoming more common. But this is just a really great, just throw all of your cache and scratch files on that drive, whether it's in DaVinci Resolve, Photoshop, After Effects, whatever. All of your cache files go on that drive. And that does a couple of things. Often it gives you a little bit of a performance gain, not huge, but small. But also it makes it really easy to clear your cache. Like if you need to clear out your cache of everything, you just go into that drive and Explorer and just delete it all. And like usually the apps will recreate the file structure. So it's really easy to clear cache. But also it can make the reliability of your system a little bit better. So cache files are a lot of small writes, and SSDs, whether NVMe or SATA drive, have a finite amount of writes they can do before they are more prone to failure. And So it's really great to isolate them on this one drive, because if all of those cache files cause the drive to fail in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, well, if that drive fails, like, who cares? Like, it's full of temporary files. You can switch over all the cache locations to your OS drive temporarily until you can replace the drive. And like, yeah, it's a little annoying, but like, you're not like down a system. You're not, it's not a huge giant, everything's on fire problem. Whereas if the cache files are all on your OS drive, well, if your OS drive fails, that's a lot bigger of a problem. So it's really great to have those on their own drive. Just spreads out the life. If that drive fails, again, it's a lot less of an issue. And then we also like to do a dedicated drive for like your media and assets. This really is where workflow makes a big difference. Some people do an NVMe drive for this. Some people do an SSD. Some people are moving over to like a NAS unit, especially if you're multiple editors. So totally depends on what you're doing. And then some people even opt for like a fourth drive for longer term storage, whether it's a platter drive, big SSDs, or again NAS, are really where things kind of come into play here. Okay, I did have a quick section here on other considerations that I was just going to kind of fill in. If you have any questions, now is a great time to put them in. I see we already have, I think, 8 questions, and we'll get to those. And while people are putting in a couple of last questions, I will just talk about a few last things here. First of all, Windows 11. So Windows 11 has been out for a little while now, and it's not worth worrying about, I think, in most cases. So most systems aren't going to get much of a performance boost. And in fact, in a lot of our testing, Windows 11 is still a little bit slower. We're not sure why, but it tends to be a little bit slower. We did some testing when Windows 11 first launched about that. I think we're doing a refresh to that testing in the next month or so. So if you're really curious about that, you can keep an eye on our articles. Has a few nice features, nothing really worth freaking out about, I don't think. And there are still some bugs and stuff. It's a newer OS. So typically what our recommendation right now is Windows 11 is good if you have an Intel 12th gen CPU. Those are the ones that have the hybrid architecture, and Windows 11 is supposed to be a little bit better at taking advantage of that. I think it could be worth it if you do if you have ultra wide monitors. They added some new window snapping things that I think is useful for ultra wides. So you could think about it in that case. Obviously not critical, but it could be a consideration. But especially don't upgrade if you have a CPU with more than 32 cores. That seems to be where we see the biggest performance issues when you go above 32 cores. So if you have like a 64 core Threadripper Pro or something, yeah, I'd probably stay on Windows 10 for right now. A few other things. Don't forget connectivity. You're often going to want to have a deck link card. So if you're thinking about doing a triple GPU, well, make sure you still got room for like a deck link, because you're probably going to want that clean video out. If you're using a NAS, you probably want at least 10G networking, as long as your network and your NAS supports it. Perhaps even 25 or 100G. I know right now we're doing a lot of work qualifying 100G networking cards, and oh man, I'll tell you right now, it's not easy. That stuff is not really designed for workstations very often, but we're trying to get all that stuff going. So you'll see more and more of that from us. If you need Thunderbolt, make sure that the platform is going to play well. We actually have to do a lot of qualification and testing around Thunderbolt on our systems, because it's a little bit more problematic on PC than it is on Mac, just because there's so many different parts. You've got the motherboard and the Thunderbolt controller and the firmware and the BIOS and the drivers, and there's a lot of more different people, and they all have to do it right. And if any one of them screws up, well, then it's not going to work right. Whereas with Apple, they control everything, so they can be in charge of it all. So we have to do a little bit more qualification. All of our systems should work great with Thunderbolt that have it. It's, again, one of the big things we qualify for. But keep that in mind if you need Thunderbolt. Last, I actually don't think this is last, but second to last, just always remember hardware doesn't replace workflow. You can have the beefiest system, the best system for DaVinci Resolve, and if you're doing things that aren't great as far as like workflow goes, it's gonna act like a toaster. You might as well be working on one of these new smart toasters. So a lot of that comes down to like using codecs that have hardware decoding support their system can handle. So don't use H.264 42 to 10-bit or something. Maybe you should go up to HEVC, and it'll give you hardware decoding support, and it'll fix a lot of your performance problems. Things like that. So even the beefiest system, you're not always going to be able to get away from doing optimized media or proxies and those kind of workflows, but it can certainly help in a lot of cases, of course. But yeah, workflow's very, very important. You can't brute force it with money. And always consider other components. I mean, we talked about things that directly impact performance, but like your chassis and your cooling is going to make a big difference, especially now that things throttle so much, up and down based on cooling. Power supply is critical, especially for reliability. Motherboard is just critical, period, for everything: reliability, performance, connectivity, again, cooling. So we talk most about performance, but make sure you consider the entire thing. Especially if you're going out and buying like a pre-built, Dell's, HP's, Lenovo's, and stuff. Some of those systems are used kind of crappy power supplies or not great motherboards, not great coolers. So do make sure you consider the entire everything. Okay, and with that, we made it. It ended up being at 1 hour exactly rather than 45 minutes. So I think we're going to have to switch our webinars to just say an hour always, because I seem to always go over. If you're looking for more content for us, always check out our YouTube channel. Our articles are always great. We also do live streams or streams on Wednesdays, I believe, often. You can also check us out on Twitter and other social medias. I'm only on Twitter, but feel free to hit me up on Twitter if you've got any questions after this or anything. If you're looking at a new system, getting a new system, and you want to talk with our consultants, there's a big old button at the top right of our website for talk to an expert. Our consultants, they're not on commission or anything like that. They're not going to force you into anything. I mean, we're known in the industry for not pushing people into things and really helping them, get what it is that they actually need. So there's no pressure, but if you are looking for a system, check us out. And with that, let's get to some questions. And if anyone is ducking out right now, thank you very much for coming along. We are trying to do more and more webinars. We might be changing the style of them a little bit in the future here, but we will be doing more. And again, thank you very much for attending. Okay, a few of these I think we already answered, so I'm just going to kind of skip over them if it is something we answer. I guess I'll mention them and I'll just give a quick. How well does Resolve scale with multiple GPUs? So we touched on that, about a 40% going from 1 to 2, about a 25% typically going from 2 to 3, and about 10% beyond that. And it's mostly going to be with noise reduction and open effects. Why does it seem not recommending AMD graphics Radeon Pro? Because they are not great for DaVinci Resolve and most content creation. Radeon Pro is really, I feel, their strong suit is in like engineering, simulation kind of stuff, like engineering simulation. They're just not typically great for things like DaVinci Resolve and content creation. Performance isn't there. Drivers typically aren't as there. We tend to, whenever we do testing, they tend to have a little bit more problems than NVIDIA. So that's mainly the reason why we stick to NVIDIA. So someone's talking about they travel a lot, so they can't use a desktop. Business class workstation laptop. GPU with 8 gigs minimum. Intel GPU with possibly AV1. Okay, so this has got a lot in here. First of all, laptop stuff. I am actually quite a fan on the laptop side of the MacBooks, especially the new the M1s and the new M2s. I actually have an M1 back there. For laptops, I think those things are terrific. So you might want to consider that. If you do need to stick with PC or Windows laptops, yeah, definitely GPU with 8 gigs of RAM, I think is very important. I don't know if I'd call it a minimum. You can probably get away with lower. You're going to have to do a lot more work, with proxies and things like that, which on a laptop you're probably familiar with. The Intel GPU stuff, it's hard to know. That stuff is technically launched now. I don't think we've seen any testing or benchmarks, and we don't typically work with laptops, so we're probably going to wait until there's desktops, or desktop GPUs. But it's a first gen product. I don't think they're supposed to be anything crazy for performance. I would probably skip the Intel, the ARC GPUs. The iGPU stuff that's built into the CPU, that stuff's great. That's how you get QuickSync. But yeah, I probably wouldn't go with an Intel GPU, discrete GPU on a laptop. I'd probably stick with NVIDIA. Also asked about AV1 support. I know there's a lot of stuff on hardware. As far as I'm aware, DaVinci Resolve doesn't support exporting to AV1, neither does like Premiere. So I think we still have a little ways before we start seeing AV1 like as a part of people's workflows. I mean, if you're doing it, yeah, you might want to consider that. But I think usually iGPUs, the Intel iGPUs and QuickSync have that anyway. So that's the way I would go. So if you're doing a PC laptop, stick with an Intel CPU, NVIDIA GPU, preferably 8 gigs or above, if possible. And like RAM, yeah, you're probably going to want 32 gigs and above as well. I'm just going to flag these so I don't miss them. Okay, moving on. Recently upgraded to Windows 11. Um, their card format is UDF is no longer recognized. Why this happens? Okay, so you're having problems with a card formatted with UDF not recognizing. It's probably a Windows 11 bug. It would be my guess. If because if it doesn't even if your computer doesn't even like see it in device or Explorer, it's probably a problem with Windows. So I mean that could be it fixed. That kind of stuff, who knows when it'd get fixed? Honestly, it's probably your best bet just going back down to Windows 10, unless there's some workflow or some workaround. That's not somewhere that I'm super familiar with. If you happen to have one of our systems, talk to our support. If you don't, do a lot of Googling, but that sounds like a very much a Windows 11 issue to me. Uh, know how PC is going to compare with the new Mac Pro and the new M1 and M2 chips. In DaVinci Resolve, not as much yet. Typically, based on like our testing with like Premiere and stuff, the M1s hold up very well versus laptops, but they just don't have the oomph to compare to a desktop, especially with like Resolve, where you're using like GPU, heavy GPU things. So um, I think again, I said this earlier. I think they're great as far as like a laptop platform goes. The new Mac Pro and all that stuff. I think one of the biggest issues, especially with DaVinci Resolve, is the fact that Apple they're not using NVIDIA. That's largely what it comes down to. Whether it's their own chips or whether they're using, they use a lot of AMD GPUs. NVIDIA just has such good performance that when you get into things like noise reduction and open effects, it's just going to be so much faster on a PC workstation with NVIDIA GPU. Again, things like processing H264, ProRes, BRAW, a lot of that stuff is going to be okay, and they're going to probably be pretty darn good. But if you're doing a lot of that heavy stuff, again, noise reduction, especially a lot of nodes in your color tree, probably you're still going to get quite a few. We are hoping that we're going to get our benchmark, our DaVinci Resolve benchmark, to have a Mac support sometime soon. It's really hard with there's so much going on to prioritize that, but hopefully in the next 6 months or so, we'll have a version of our Resolve benchmark that'll work on all Macs, whether it's M1, M2, the Intel-based ones. So hopefully we'll be able to answer that question a little bit more concisely here in the future. Um, Someone's asking, number of lanes, is that important for M.2 drives? So Threadripper is still the one for this. Yes, I would say if you want to have multiple M.2 drives, especially more than two, Threadripper Pro is especially better. Threadripper Pro has 128 PCIe lanes, and that's a lot. So to have even quad GPU at X16, you only need 64 lanes. So that leaves another 64 lanes for M.2 drives, and M.2 drives are typically X4. So that's whatever 64 divided by 4 is how many M.2 drives they can support. I mean, there's other things on the, Thunderbolt will take up some lanes, sometimes USB controllers. But yeah, if you want a lot of M.2s, Threadripper Pro especially, that's the way to go, I think. Um, any considerations for HEDT core count for multitasking? Using it alongside other stuff. Yes, I think, we kind of talked about how HEDT is kind of going away. But in general, yes, more cores do help with multitasking, trying to do more things all at once, even if it's like you got Slack and Zoom and a bunch of other stuff, YouTube. So yes, more cores do help. But honestly, the consumer CPUs, like the 12900K, it has 8 performance cores and 6, how many? I don't know, 8 efficient cores or something. Like those consumer CPUs, if you go up to like the 16 core models, they do pretty darn good with that. Because even something like DaVinci Resolve, the scaling on a lot of these apps are not terribly amazing. You go from 1 to 2 cores, yeah, it's huge. 2 to 4, you get a drop off. If you want to look that up, it's called Amdahl's law. It's basically the more cores you have to get better and better and better at scaling. And something, especially like DaVinci Resolve, that uses the CPU and the GPU, it's pretty much just like functionally impossible to have good enough scaling to actually take advantage of more than, I don't know, I'm making up a number here, but let's say like 8 cores. So beyond that, it's really like all of those other cores are being used for multitasking. So yeah, you can do HEDT for if you do a lot of multitasking. Threadripper Pro especially now is the way we tend to lean. But even like those 12900K, Core i9s are pretty darn good, unless you're going very extreme. Like you want to have DaVinci Resolve like playing, and like you want to have like Fusion standalone playing, and After Effects like playing through a sequence, and Premiere Pro playing. Um, Usually multitasking isn't as big of a deal unless you're going extreme. Okay. On RAM, high clock RAM impact on QuickSync. As far as I know, it makes no impact. We've done some testing with that. It's been a few years, admittedly, but we saw like no impact. QuickSync is kind of its own thing. Now, it can impact iGPU performance. So if you're looking up like gaming benchmarks that someone might do, Tom's Hardware, Linus, those guys on iGPUs, the Intel integrated graphics, it can affect that. Doesn't seem to affect QuickSync very much. So when you're talking about hardware decoding, high clock RAM shouldn't impact things much at all. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Any tips for GPU is full issue in Resolve? So that's when you run out of video memory, VRAM in Resolve. It'll give you an error as the GPU is full and performance tanks. The tips and tricks is, well, one, get a GPU with more video memory. That's, I mean, hate to say it, but that's really like the only way of fixing that issue straight up. You can always change your workflow a little bit. Like, biggest thing is going to be your resolution. So if you don't have to be working in 4K, I'll turn it down to 1080p. Sometimes using proxies can help a little bit depending on what your source media is. I know some people, they do things like they have their noise reduction and they have that done as a, oh shoot, what's the right way to do it? You can set it so you can easily enable or disable like individual nodes globally. Oh, shit, I forget what the term is. You should be able to Google if you like look up like disable global node in Resolve. You should be able to find some guides. But some people, they'll take like their noise reduction and throw it in that, and so they can get it all set up and looking right, and then they turn it off until the very end when they're done, and then they can turn it on and export. Now you might still have that GPU full issue when you go to export, but yeah, I mean the only real way to fix it is just get a GPU with more VRAM, unfortunately. Again, there's small tips and tricks you can use to kind of get around it, but that's the like real answer. Increase eating needed to laptops. Have you run any comparisons Dell XPS 15 versus desktops? We don't. If you go to our benchmark database, so it's pugetsystems.com/benchmarks. I think it's just benchmarks, right? Yes. Here, I can even throw it on the screen. So if you go to here, sorry, there's a few hidden things because I'm on our internal IP. But you can actually search by, so you can do like XPS as far as the specs, and you can put in Resolve. Oh man, okay, we've had like none. There's a few. So you could look in here and see a few things in there. So you could search that way and try to see if you can find any results, and you can compare that to like a desktop. But we typically don't do any direct testing. Our benchmark is being used more and more by a lot of the more, I don't want to call them generic hardware reviewers, but the more catch-all hardware reviews, Tom's Hardware and Antex and stuff. So hopefully they'll start doing that stuff because we just don't have the resources to do like laptop testing too much. Memory requirements, Fusion similar to After Effects, even though it's node-based. They're looking for a balanced system. Yeah, it's pretty darn similar in that Fusion and After Effects both load each frame into RAM, and so that's where the most of the RAM requirements comes from, is because of that. And in that way, Fusion and After Effects are very similar. So the fact that After Effects is layer-based and Fusion is node-based shouldn't come too much into play as far as like if you're trying to do the same thing in both of them. So in that way, yes, they are very similar in that they just need a huge amount of RAM. Work exclusively with 4K 422 10-bit and 420 8-bit H264 H265. They let the camera make proxies. They don't want to do any proxies or transcoding. And so they've seen about the 11th and 12th gen. So talk about hardware decoding. Does it mean they can move to 100% proxyless workflow if they upgrade? Hard to say. It's always really hard to say whether something is going to be able to be proxyless. Just because, like, okay, yeah, you're doing 4K 422 10-bit. But still things are different. Like depending, the cameras record things differently, and then what's going on in the footage, how busy is it, and everything. So it is hard to say. I can say for sure that you will have a much better chance of it. Obviously, like that 422 10-bit, that has to be HEVC. Um, but as long as that is HEVC, you'll be able to take advantage of the 12th gen QuickSync. Um, Most likely, you'll be able to do it natively. But again, it's really hard to say, especially without knowing like all your other, how your color node is, your color nodes are, and all that kind of stuff. Um, if you are looking at getting a system from us, I can plug here that often we can get you to send us, hey, send us a clip from your camera that you're wanting to work with, send us a project, and we can throw it on one of our systems. We often will do like a recording of us, looking at playback and stuff, so we can tell you exactly. That's something we do for our customers. If you're building your own system, all I can tell you is most likely it should be good as long as you're not doing too much in the way of like color work and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to guarantee it because giving a guarantee is a really bad idea, but it's going to give you a heck of a better chance compared to the Ryzen system with NVIDIA card you're using right now. Um, oh man, okay. And then we're getting into some odd ones. I'm still going to get through all of these ones here. So what motherboard to recommend for Resolve? Depends on what you're doing and what CPUs you're using, what kind of GPUs you need. We tend to use right now a lot of Asus boards. Gigabyte's also great. That's probably the two top brands I would say is Asus and Gigabyte. Um, we do a lot of work with like their engineering staff directly, so it's a little bit different for us than end users. But a lot of times it just comes down to what CPU do you want, how many GPUs do you need, and then features. Finding a board that has all the features you need. Thunderbolt, 10G, and all that kind of stuff. But I still would recommend probably Asus and Gigabyte as your top as far as brand goes. Best proxies for working in Resolve with RA-RAW. In Resolve, probably going to be DNX. I'm probably not the best when you're talking about workflow things like proxies. I'm a lot more on the hardware side, but probably something like DNX HR. Shoot, what is it? They have the lower proxy version. I can't remember what it is right now. It's the equivalent to ProRes 422 proxy. There's a DNX equivalent. It's probably going to be that, but definitely with Resolve, I would stick with DNX as your proxy format if you can. RTX 3080, 10 gig versus 12 gig. I don't think we've even seen the 12 gig card ourselves. It, I would probably go 12 gig, honestly, if it was DaVinci Resolve, because having that VRAM is pretty darn important. I'm not familiar with what the price difference is, but yeah, I'd probably do 12 gig. It's probably not going to be massively different unless you're doing like you're trying to cram in like 6K into one of those cards. But yeah, 12 gig should be great, as long as you're not giving up performance. Is motherboard SSD cooling better than an SSD with integral cooling? I'm not sure. If you're still here, you might want to look through the. Yeah, he's still here. You might want to kind of clarify on that. I'm going to skip because I'm not sure what you mean with that one. Advantage of using a deck link for display out, has the SDIs. Does it actually give better color? Yes. So the problem with using just the video straight out of your video card, it's better now than it used to be. It used to be that like if you wanted 10-bit display out, you had to use a G or a Quadro. Now GeForce has that as well. They've had it since the last. Oh, it was added during the last in-person Adobe Max. So that would be 2019. So you don't need to use like Quadro anymore for that. But the problem is when you're going through your video card, the driver can change things a little bit. Windows changes things a little bit. You can calibrate it and get it pretty darn close. But if you're looking for a complete clean color feed, that's where you want something like a deck link, or there's other brands, AGA and whatever. We tend to use deck links. That's where you really want it for completely clean, video out. You probably don't need it unless you're using like at least an AZO, maybe a Flander Scientific display. If you're just using like an LG or a Samsung display, yeah, it's kind of hard to say whether it'd be worth it. But if you're looking for very clean color out to a calibrated high-end display, yeah, you probably really want a deck link card for the display out. It's just going to be a much cleaner video signal, going out. Now, of course, if you just are delivering to YouTube, Well, YouTube's gonna probably compress the hell out of it. It's gonna change the colors anyway. But it's always, yeah, I think for especially higher end work, the better you can get it to start with, the less all of that extra stuff later is going to mess it up. So I think it is worth it if you are investing into a higher end system, as long as you have a nice calibrated display. How about HBBC with AMD? Gets a lot of VRAM. I think. Oh, what is HBBC? What does that stand for again? I don't remember. I think you're talking about the thing where they have NVMe drives integrated onto the card. We've looked at that, and it doesn't work well. You have to have very special software with support in order to actually take advantage of those because it actually shows up to the system as just a hard drive. So I know Premiere technically has some port. I don't know if Resolve even does. I can tell you that with how it worked in Premiere, it didn't work well. So I think they stopped even working on it years ago. So I don't think that is actually really much of a thing, if that's what you're talking about. Again, I'm not familiar with what HBBC actually means, but it gives more VRAM. Got an 8 gig card to 32 gigs. Yeah, I'm not sure even what that is. Is that just using your system memory? I don't want to sit here googling things. Well, yeah, okay. So if it just uses your system memory, that might get you around that whole like VRAM is full error, but it's going to be terribly slow. Like using system memory for VRAM, that's what a lot of applications do is they fail over from VRAM to system memory, and then from there to your hard drive page file. And typically, performance takes a huge hit as soon as you do that. So it can probably allow things to work, but it's going to be a lot slower than having a card that actually has more video memory in actuality. So yeah, it'll let you get around some bottlenecks, but man, it's going to be a bottleneck in and of itself for performance. But yeah, if you need it as a stopgap, you can't don't have the budget for a new card with more VRAM right now. Yeah, it sounds interesting. I haven't really done anything with it personally, so I can't tell you how it would actually perform compared to a card itself. Okay, so we made it through all of the questions here. It's still a good number of people hanging around for all of this. So, again, thank you very much, everyone, for coming in here. We're going to cut it off here at an hour and 20 minutes. So, thanks for sticking around. Hit us up on, check out our YouTube, check us out on Twitter if you've got any more questions. Again, if you are interested in the system, of course, check us out. But yeah, we like to do these kind of educational things. You give a lot of information out there because information should be free. And yeah. So, yep, thank you, everybody, and we will stop it here.